Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. We're getting started in just one more moment. I'm seeing our attendee list grow really rapidly, which is really exciting. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're getting started in just one more moment. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for logging in. We're giving it just one more moment. I'm still seeing the participant list go up. We'll get started very shortly. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we have hit a plateau. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. The vision of the Brown School of Professional Studies is that we envision being your lifelong partner to gaining the skills, resources, and networks that you need to transform the way the world works for good. And that's a vision I am so passionate about because every year there are research studies conducted by Gallup that looks to see what the state of the modern workforce is today. And pretty consistently, we discover that the way the world works now does not, in fact, work for the majority of people. One stat that always stands out to me is that about 70% of US workers report being disengaged at work, which leads to worse productivity, worse outcomes, but also worse mental and emotional health. We don't like being disengaged from something that we spend most of our waking hours at. And that same study finds that managers and people who manage projects actually have a disproportionate impact on that. So just by being here today, just by raising your hand and saying that you want to learn a really crucial leadership skill, you actually have the ability to make a disproportionate impact on the people around you to make the way that the world finally work for everybody. So thank you for being here today and being part of the solution. And this is a webinar that I'm particularly passionate about because of everything that's going on right now. So I did some really quick research just to even catch myself up because I think one of the things that's been so difficult is that things are changing so quickly. And what we're starting to see is this really interesting paradox. On the one hand, we're seeing that about 1 in 8 companies say that they plan to reduce or eliminate their DEI programs this year because of political pressures, economic constraints, and challenges in measuring return on investment. However, on the other hand, we're seeing that the public perception remains really positive. According to a 2024 Washington Post poll, they found that 60% of Americans view DEI programs positively. So we're seeing this paradox where the majority of people are supportive, but we're seeing increasingly that organizations are becoming hesitant for, very valid reasons. And so I'm really excited that today we have Jarvis Sam here to help us to figure out the best way to navigate DEI programs, initiatives, and successes through this era of polarization. And I really couldn't think of anyone better than Jarvis to lead us through this. He is the professor of the practice at Brown's School of Professional Studies, the CEO and founder of the multi-services diversity, equity, and inclusion firm, The Rainbow Disruption, and the former chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer at Nike. Most importantly to me personally, he is our creator and instructor for our Applied Inclusive Leadership Strategy Certificate, which I'll tell you more about towards the end of this program because I learned something new from him every single time we do one of these webinars. And I hope that by the end of today's session, you're as enthusiastic as I am about learning from him and you'd like to continue your learning journey, and we'll give you that path forward for that as well. He was named Forbes 30 under 30 in sports class of 2021, as well as Portland Business Journal's 40 under 40. And like I said, he is our developer, creator, and instructor for our Applied Inclusive Leadership Strategy Certificate. One last housekeeping note, and I'll turn things over to you, Jarvis, is if you have a question at any time, please click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on Q&A, and type and submit your questions there. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A throughout, so I'll be ready to help answer as many questions or help ask to Jarvis, who will then answer as many questions as possible at the end. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Jarvis, for being here and leading us through this really crucial topic. And welcome, I'll turn things over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Allison. Hello, everybody. It is such a great pleasure to be connected with each and every one of you. As Allison mentioned, my name is Jarvis Sam. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm thrilled to get to chat with you all today, actually, about a topic that obviously holds a lot of space for me personally and professionally. As a practitioner who's been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for around 15 years now, and having done work across academia, in professional settings with both nonprofit and for-profit, including Fortune 100 and 500 organizations from elementary education forward. It's been such a troubling time, troubling experience for many of us to continue to witness some of the current challenges that we're seeing to diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, I'm never one that exists in a space of doom and gloom, and trust me, all hope is not lost. We need to be facilitating more conversations, though, just like this one, to help us to understand so what and now what around what we're navigating. The reality is this: for many years, research conducted by folks like myself, my various colleagues in academic spaces, as well as in management consulting spaces, have continued to affirm for us through research and literature why diversity matters. As many of us know, famed research studies from groups like McKinsey and Company and Deloitte have continued to affirm that there's an incredible business impact to the facilitation of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations. There is undoubtedly a strong connection to employee experience, and not to mention, for those that are joining us from academic spaces, the effect that diversity, equity, and inclusion has on both student and faculty life continues to be affirmed through research and literature, forcing us to question, though, if the data continues to validate the impact of DEI, why is it that we continue to see such change, challenge, and pushback? And arguably, and more importantly, what do we do about it? This background sets the grounding for the lecture that we'll cover today on how do we navigate DEI in a polarized world. While I will spend some time giving you some context around what it is exactly that we're navigating, we'll actually spend the majority of our time talking about what it is that you as leaders can do to have impact that not only allows us to be legally compliant with the current zeitgeist connected to DEI, but allows you to continue to reap the incredible benefits to both business and experience with this space. But let's kick us off. First and foremost, we recognize we're in an incredibly divided landscape. But to clarify, this landscape didn't start January 20th, 2025. In fact, it holds its roots for decades prior to that, as we understand both the historical impact of how diversity, equity, and inclusion was even developed, challenges to it over time, and how that leads to what we're navigating at present. Here's what we do know, though: socially, politically, economically, and environmentally, polarization exists in a world of a divided landscape. We're continuing to see change and challenge rooted in the driving of cultural division. And the most unfortunate reality: negative rhetoric and misinformation continues to surround how DEI is being communicated. Notice on the whole, the majority of the time that you see the topic referred to, particularly in terms of federal either legislation or executive orders, it only utilizes the term DEI. It's because that acronym or initialism has continued to be surrounded by a negative ethos rooted in the idea of a zero-sum game. That for one individual group or party to win, it has to come at the expense of another. Specifically, this has been so closely tied to race, where we now see the demonization and weaponization of terms like affirmative action, which we know have actually had such a powerful and profound impact, not only on American workplaces, but of course in academic institutions and settings as well. But to be clear, for the majority of us, our work does not start or stop within the four walls of our institutions, or much rather, the borders of this country. We see that the implication of negative rhetoric surrounding DEI is having a deeply globalized impact. I know our friends to the north, and I'm seeing a lot of folks that are joining us actually from Canada, have engaged in a lot of conversations around this topic over the last several weeks alone, particularly with a recent election. How we talk about and navigate this, though, forces us to consider how do we overcome what's called active polarization, and then ultimately understand the impact of the DEI imperative. Here's what we must know. Polarization is not just a hypothetical, folks. It's happening very actively. In fact, across multiple ties of Congress, we're seeing a deeply polarized construct around who's either for DEI or against it. But much of the challenge is oftentimes rooted in a lack of understanding of what it is to begin with. For many years, DEI practitioners have proudly affirmed that DEI is not a nice to have, but rather a business imperative. But right now, if the argument is true that this work is a business imperative, and yet we're forced to grapple with how do we do it in a way that is challenging or going up against certain legal or federal constructs, it's important that we know it's not just a nice to have. It's not just a business imperative. Rather, it's an exercise in corporate resilience and our ability to maintain and uphold our values as organizations under pressure. And while we'll walk through a couple of case studies throughout our time together today, illuminating what happens when organizations positively and proactively commit to DEI, it's just as important that we look at those who have not and the unfortunate reality that it has had on their experiences. So let's uncover it. It's important that we recognize what is the current state of DEI sentiment. What are people actually feeling or seeing? If you're like me, for many of you, you wake up every day and you read various different headlines, and the amalgamation of these different sentiments can position you into a space of doom and gloom, where it will feel like, I support DEI. I work in this space. I've been an active proponent and practitioner of it for years. Why is it that the majority of people actually don't value it? Well, the reason is that sentiment's just not true. In fact, a Gallup poll in 2024 discovered that 67% of employees say that DEI is important when choosing an employer. From the moment of talent attraction and recruit employment branding, we see that this is an important characteristic for individuals when considering an institution. However, this is juxtaposed by the fact that when we look at corporate DEI budgets, for about 58% of organizations, they have either stalled or shrunk since 2024. The reason? There have been 32 state legislation bills this year alone, another 62 from the year of 2024 that are anti DEI or in some way reference the concept of DEI as being problematic. This is where this becomes even more challenging, though as we take a look at the impact of diversity across generations. For the first time in corporate history, many organizations have, in some instances, 4, even 5 generations represented as part of their workforce. The reason? Baby boomer generations are staying in the workforce much longer. And as we continue to see, particularly for organizations that have a retail, distribution, or manufacturing component, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are entering the workforce that much earlier. Here's why this can be a challenge. Gen Z and millennials, for example, already comprise nearly 50+% of organizational workforces. The issue, in terms of Gen Z values, recent research studies done in 2023 and later corroborated earlier this year discovered that 48% of Gen Z values highlight that they would leave an organization if it is not aligned to their personal values. When we dig into research done by organizations like GLAAD that continues to show that Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ plus or as a gender identity not rooted in a binary of male and female more than any other previous generation, it implies that our conversations about DEI are not just nice to have. They matter in terms of employee sentiment and the likelihood to retain employees. When you overlay that, folks, and do the cost benefit analysis of what it means to both lose a talent to attrition and have to rehire that role, it starts to create a significant cost impact on organizations, which ultimately has a result on broader profitability. The other challenge. This is not just DEI sentiment rooted in the employee's perspective. I've often said, and one of the mantras that I uphold is that the most successful organizations help to ensure congruence between the employee experience and the consumer experience. And consumer reactivity to pullbacks and shrinking of DEI commitments continue to be seen in various different case studies that we'll talk about in a moment. But here's what we're up against and what we're navigating. I mentioned to you that we didn't just get here in January of this year. A lot of what we're navigating started many years before. When we take a look, for example, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, in 1964, the 80th Congress, alongside Lyndon Baines Johnson, moved forward with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, including some amazing provisions like Title VII, promoting the protection against discrimination, particularly in employment spaces. We started to see a lot of movement within the US around how we think about, talk about, and navigate experiences that ultimately are tied to what we currently know as DEI. DEI was never born, though, out of an idea of giving one community an advantage over the other. So let's reset on exactly what do I mean by DEI. Diversity, by definition, is the amalgamation of all of the lived experiences and perspectives that each and every one of us holds. What does this mean? DEI is not inherently anti-white. It's not anti-male. It's not anti-straight. It's not anti-Christian. It's not anti-American. It's not anti-political. In fact, it's all of those different nuances and experiences of our own rich diversity brought together. That's the essence of what diversity is. Inclusion. And then those actions that we take as individuals, institutions, peers, partners, and teams to help celebrate and understand the nuance of those deep experiences to which we share, finding the impact of both commonality and difference, and how it allows us to grow and move toward being more adaptable in our ability to bridge difference and manage and navigate conflict across difference. Now, the piece that gets everybody all hung up is that context around equity and why it matters. Well, put simply, folks, equity is this. It is the ability to recognize that because we all come from different starting points, the distribution and allocation of resources to move us closer toward fairness has to consider those experiences for us to create the conditions for success. Again, because we all come from different backgrounds and experiences, different starting points, the allocation and distribution of resources to try to move us closer toward fairness has to consider those differences when creating solutions for groups. It is not enough to simply think about this as give everybody the same and hope for the best. Because the unfortunate reality is based on our identities, backgrounds, experiences. Remember, all of those unique things that create a beautifully diverse workforce and environment also make the way in which we navigate and experience the world that much different. And so from 1964 until early 2025, there were a lot of different programs, policies, and practices that were put in place meant to elaborate upon that topic and meant to illuminate how we think about the concept of equity. One of those, of course, was systems of affirmative action. However, in 2023, we saw the U.S. Supreme Court case of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard limit race-conscious considerations in admissions into academic institutions. From there, we begin to see state executive orders double down on this and affirm it even more. Out of states like Alabama, Texas, and of course, Florida's very famous Stop Woke Act, as well as Texas Senate Bill 17, banning things like DEI offices. But be clear, while DEI is the term that is utilized to capture all of these experiences in an umbrella, everybody, it is so much more than that. Whether it's the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the impact on women's reproductive rights and access, whether it is continued limitations that we see on gay marriage, whether it's the continued attacks against transgender and non-binary communities and the refusal to actually avoid engaging in rhetoric that is not just attacking or harmful in word, but truly that enables and in some ways incentivizes violence against these communities, are all tied to why the work of DEI matters. And what's more, for many individuals, colleges and universities, and our workspaces, folks, those were oftentimes deemed the most protective safe havens for us. In fact, organizations position themselves as spaces where even if folks were not accepted by their families or in their communities, that they were places where through employee resource groups, unconscious bias awareness systems, and so much more, people could find safety and protection. And so imagine the impact, which can feel in a lot of ways like psychological forced trauma to people. when organizations remove commitments in the space. What's more, under Attorney General Pam Bundy, we continue to see a lot of red states now probing companies for what they're dubbing as reverse discrimination in hiring, with recent attacks by her office specifically on law firms and other legal institutions. It creates what's known as a chilling effect, where companies are quietly rolling back their DEI commitments and efforts, and the unfortunate reality is that it is on the whole the employees and the consumers who face the biggest impact. And so what does that look like? Well, corporate retrenchment rather has been quite challenging. Major companies like Meta, Twitter, and Amazon cut critical DEI positions in 2023 and 2024, with dozens of other institutions following suit after. We continue to see restructured departments, with many organizations folding under public pressure and not dedicating resources to support this experience. For many of you that may be unaware of the work and sentiment of one Robbie Starbuck, we note that his name is thrown around a ton in the anti-DEI movement, where shareholder proposals are being launched and levied, most of which have actually been declined or denied by shareholders of organizations when it goes to vote. But he continues to pressure organizations to remove DEI programs, arguing that it somehow positions, quote, woke rhetoric that is necessarily anti-white and creates a zero-sum game for some communities over others. And we recognize that's just not the true reality of how we protect DEI. What I am comfortable with, the corporate retrenchment, is some organizations have chosen to shift terminology, utilizing terms like engagement, belonging, team strength, candidate experience, etc., avoiding certain politically charged terms, but maintaining the intent and impact. However, I'm a firm believer in the construct that words matter. And so while we may call the work something different, it is imperative that we recognize that lens on equity, that distribution and allocation of resources giving due consideration to the individual starting points of people cannot go away. Because if we are to improve both our workplaces, our academic institutions, and our society, it is imperative that we know and understand our history to avoid it from being rewritten or revised, as we are continuing to see as recent as today, as critical artifacts are being removed from the National African American History Museum right now. The most unfortunate reality: DEI jobs and organizations and academic institutions are largely held by Black and Latino identified individuals. And so the impact of this layoff has resulted in 40% of DEI professionals that have been laid off since 2023 as being Black or Latino, leaving these communities who were charged with and installed in roles to do the work now being positioned as some of the most vulnerable amongst us, implying the systemic nature of how we navigate this. So what's the economic impact, folks? Well, as McKinsey and Company found in 2020, when they took a look at organizations in a pre-2020 world, so remember, this is before George Floyd's murder, before we saw advanced investment by organizations and institutions, their work continued to prove a 36% higher likelihood of profitability than companies that were lagging in this space. When we take a look, though, at a post-2020 timeframe, so post-significant investment by organizations, research continues to reveal an 11% decline in brand trust for organizations that don't show a direct commitment to DEI investment. But don't believe me. Simply take a look at the case study of Target Corp. Now, Target Corp is an organization that for many years I'm upheld actually in high esteem and regard because of their efforts and commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you can imagine the unfortunate impact on both the consumer side and the employee side when we see an organization very publicly pendulum swinging back and forth within a matter of days and even weeks around commitment, lack of commitment, support through product and merch and marketing versus not, support of employee driven programs versus not. And it leads to a lot of change. Unfortunately, the organization continues to be affected by both protest of the product and brand, by blackouts from lack of consumer support, having a significant impact not only on foot traffic within their retail stores, but an impact to their digital business and, of course, ultimately profitability of the organization. Now, all hope is not lost, folks. Unfortunately, there is something that the organization can do, but starting with employee engagement is key. Cutting DEI programs, for example, has been shown to result in a 9% lower employee engagement score. However, when you pair it up with an impact on statistics around things like mental health awareness and acuity within organizations, that number undoubtedly continues to drop at an even greater rate, as highlighted even by some of our teammates in the chat. So here's what we have to overcome when we think about this ecosystem. Misinformation must be challenged. For one, a lot of framing tactics tend to imply that DEI creates a system of preferential treatment rather than equity-focused systems. One of the most common things that we see is that DEI is put at odds with or viewed as the antithesis of meritocracy. When the reality is, if we look to actual philosophies around the most meritocratic organizations, institutions, or governmental systems historically, it is clear that it is only with diversity and a focus on ensuring that everybody has a fair opportunity to compete that we're even able to see what meritocratic outcomes could actually look like. What's more, we continue to see deliberate misinterpretation of the law and of history to argue that equal opportunity is viewed as out of compliance. For example, you see this term thrown around as reverse discrimination. Well, the reality is this: the law has always upheld, since the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Acts in 1968, and more, that discrimination on face and on its own is illegal, including but not limited to discrimination against white individuals or white men. This concept of reverse discrimination seems to imply that traditional discrimination can only happen to some parties, whereas other parties are subjected to something else. Either the behavior that is being leveraged is discriminatory in nature or not. It is quite binary in how we assess it. What this means, though, is terms like meritocracy or reverse discrimination can become weaponized, transforming inclusive language into politically charged buzzwords that often trigger outrage. For example, there's a lot of metadata and studies that have been done that ask people, mostly in red states in much of the southern United States, why they are so opposed to DEI. And the reality is, these folks cannot even tell you what the initialism or acronym DEI stands for. They simply know that they hate it. This drives key amplifiers, for example, meaning things like strategic coalitions and think tanks that continue to create a divisive narrative rooted in how we navigate it. And the reality is this, folks: the risk of doing nothing is harmful. Take a listen to this. 73% of investors consider DEI in decisions, with companies retreating from those commitments facing significant valuation impacts. Look at just in the last several weeks: Goldman Sachs, Disney, John Deere, Lowe's, just to name a few, all received shareholder proposals tied to rooting away or organizations getting rid of their DEI approaches. All of those, to the tune of between 90 and 99%, failed. Every time they failed. Because investor communities understand the impact of the research that continues to affirm that DEI is great for business and better for organizations. What's more, the changing nature and landscape of our organizations: 75% of our workforce by 2030 will be comprised of Gen Z and millennial populations, and they rank diversity as a top priority in their consideration for engagement in opportunities. Not to mention, the legal and reputational risks that result from this can be quite challenging. Here's what a lot of organizations are not considering: Title VII is still a very real thing. Traditional so-called discrimination cases, meaning if I can affirm that as a very proud black gay man that an organization has discriminated against me on the basis of standardized employment practices, those cases are still heard and still hold the same weight. And unfortunately, if these organizations cannot prove that they have built good faith efforts that are legally compliant into their model and system, it becomes very difficult for them to defend themselves from a case like that, resulting in legal risk connected to Title VII violations. And ultimately, as we see with the case of Target Corp, can result in significant reputational risk. Because the reality: inaction is not neutral, it carries consequences, and silence is often viewed as complicity. So here's what I want you to do. Now that you understand this backdrop, what's arguably most important for me to help you understand is so what and now what. Here's what we do. We need a new imperative for how we talk about DEI. And it has to start with the idea of reframing our context around what it is that we do, the impact that we have, and how we navigate it. Retreat is not the answer, though. We have to leverage a from to model. We have to move from symbolism. For many of our organizations, let's be real, y'all, it was a lot of performative things that would happen. Couple of parties, overpriced and overpaid speakers during Black History Month and Pride, things to satiate or satisfy certain communities. We did it. We did it. Lack of resourcing, support, and commitment to those that are doing the work. We did it. We made a lot of performative statements that were rooted in symbolism, and this has allowed for our work to be led and subjected to attack. Well, I'm obviously not happy about the social impacts and legal implications of things like executive orders that are happening right now. What I think that it is doing is it's forcing us to get better about our work, people. It's forcing us to navigate this in a more meaningful way. We have to avoid cutting programs that were pilots that just didn't work. If we're going to make the investment, see it through, measure it, be actionable about our approach. This is a move from symbolism to substance. DEI needs to be embedded in all of our business practices and approaches. One of the proudest moments of my work in DEI at Nike was that we tied our DEI work so closely to our corporate strategy. Considering how this work comes to life in a global context, whether navigating APAC, EMEA, North America, LATAM, and more. Whether it was looking to its effect on our retail population, distribution center, or corporate employees, this tie to the work helped us to integrate inclusion within all of our operating and strategic capacities. We established metrics-based accountability. It wasn't just about tying goals or results to leader outcomes or compensation. It was about understanding that our consumer is uniquely diverse. For those in academia, your student population is uniquely diverse. How we create systems that support their experience only happens when we link DEI to our business results. And we'll talk about how to do that in a moment. But what's more, we got to shift from identity to equity. Equity is focused on process, identity is focused on individuals. Now, I'm not saying we move away from this altogether. It is important that we understand the impact of demographic differences. It is imperative that we acknowledge intersectionality, not just as a construct, but as a lived reality for people. It is imperative that we as organizations address underlying barriers and structural systems that negatively impact people's experiences. But far too often, folks, pre-2020 and in the 2 to 3 years just following George Floyd's murder, organizations took such a deeply programmatic approach that this is what resulted in the zero-sum point of view. Y'all, in doing this work, I cannot tell you the number of conversations I have had to navigate where folks from different communities will say, well, we did this for the Black community. We supported or amplified Black Lives Matter. What does that mean for me as a Jewish identified person, as an AAPI identified person, as a gay person, as a lesbian person, as a trans person? That's the wrong rhetoric. This is not a zero-sum game. We can all benefit. The age-old adage that the tide can indeed help all boats to rise when the wave is positioned in the right way is so more important now than ever before. But what this means is the demographic focus that we historically had as organizations of exclusively focusing on identity is just one thing. Equity, though, is where we think about process and practice. It's fair systems, folks. Auditing for bias, designing for equal opportunity, removing obstacles that continue to persist, and creating space and environment where it is rooted systemically. It is easy to attack an individual. It is easy to attack a group. It is difficult to attack a system. Be clear. Systems that were built to define the dissolution of DEI programs and strategies at the governmental level were done systemically. It was called Project 2025. It was all out front and in front of all of us. And to be clear, what I'm affirming to you right now is not a political discussion. It's not a perspective on my own politics. It is a factual point of view on what happened. Project 2025 had entire segments affirming that DEI was going to go away. And so the only way to challenge systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic misogyny, systemic misogynoir is to also build systemic and structural outcomes that challenge these same obstacles. Strategic priorities for navigating DEI resilience are as follows then, folks. Within your organizations, make sure that equity is embedded into your talent systems. Whether it's hiring, promotion, pay equity audits, ensure that we're thinking about it through a lens of equity, through those starting points. This remains legally compliant. If we move away from simply considering it just from a demographic standpoint and actually understand how are our systems being positioned to effectuate change and ensure equal and equitable opportunities for all and outcomes therein, that's how you promote resilience. Number two, future proof inclusive leadership. Our leaders need to understand topics like psychological safety, empathy, and cultural intelligence. You see, within all of those, I didn't even mention the term DEI. I didn't mention diversity, equity, or inclusion. But the work done by Dr. Amy Edmondson, for example, on psychological safety, the work done by the incredible Dr. Erin Meyer on cultural intelligence, the leadership work that Dr. Brene Brown continues to highlight on empathy and its distinguishment from sympathy, that's what people need to know. Is how do we translate some of these topics like emotional intelligence into real impact on inclusive leadership? There is a way to do this work, folks, without ever mentioning the term DEI, but still getting the same outcomes with which we desire. Every single day, my team over at the Rainbow Disruption leads and teaches trainings and sessions on psych safety, empathy, cultural intelligence within our certificate program here at Brown. I've intentionally built these constructs into these topics. What's interesting, you all, we built this certificate program 2 years ago. And yet, the way that I think about this in terms of my Myers-Briggs results, folks. I'm very much a futurist. And in leveraging things like the Anti-DEI Act, Project 2025, I understood where a lot of this work was going. And so we intentionally built that into this certificate to equip leaders like you all with the capability to navigate some of these topics. Data transparency is key, though, as well. Assess what commitments we've made and have reported on externally. Think about how we talk about that to our teammates internally. Remember this, though. Transparency does not mean telling everybody everything all the time. Okay? Transparency, on the contrary, is telling people enough information that they can then utilize that to do something with it. But they also must be empowered to do something with this information. And make sure we focus on narrative control. We have to train our executives how to speak about this topic. It helps us to avoid unnecessary risk while also keeping us continually committed to how we communicate confidently and clearly. A few things that you can do: make sure the DEI is tied to your business goals. Ensure that programs and practices are open to all, including but not limited to those ERGs, folks. Far too often, employee resource groups tend to come across as only for the demographic to which they are serving. Make sure that you're clear. They're open to all. And that doesn't mean that we can't continue to program to speak from the eye of communities of specific backgrounds, but they have to be open to all to promote innovation and control of risk management. There's a couple of case studies of organizations that I think are doing this well. Organizations like Ben and Jerry's, Microsoft, and while Microsoft has changed some nomenclature and naming conventions, they continue their work and publicly double downing on their commitment in the space. And be clear, no organization is perfect here, folks. Every organization is or will have to change in some capacity how they navigate this, but these are a few ones that I've seen do great work in this space. And throughout our time in the certificate program, we review a lot of other case studies as well that help us to unpick exactly how the best organizations are leveraging this. Here is what your leaders need to know now. First of all, growth in CQ. Many of you have probably heard of IQ, the intelligence quotient. You've probably heard of EQ, the emotional quotient. Few folks, though, have heard of CQ, the cultural quotient. This is about leading across lines of difference fairly and equitably. It is important that we become aware of our own biases. And folks, this is not an unconscious bias awareness training. I cannot tell you enough how over those I am, because they oftentimes do this. You're biased. And here's an index list or a glossary of the various types of bias and the definitions to which they hold. This leaves our leaders feeling disempowered, feeling that they're in a problematic position, or unable to know so what and now what. Rather, focus on cultural intelligence and our commitment to our organizational values. Highlight that bias can create an impediment to that. And then our goal is to overcome that through things like allyship, psychological safety in environments and spaces. That's how we should think about it, folks. Crisis communication is key here, though. We need a lot of folks actively engaged in this dialogue around how shared values come together under pressure. Consistency is key. We have to handle tough talks, deliver key messages, and answer criticism openly, honestly and take both responsibility and accountability. But what's more, policy knowledge is key. We have to know legal limits and rights. There is a difference between being compliant and over complying and hyper complying. I talked to USA Today couple of weeks back in the Washington Post a few weeks before that. And the term that I used is plausible deniability. I think that a lot of organizations were looking for reasons to get rid of their DEI investments, and the federal government under the Trump administration has given them that reason and rationale. And so they are moving toward overcompliance or hypercompliance just to make it happen. Policy knowledge, though, helps us to keep up with the changes, do things that help us to avoid risk, while also working with both our legal teams to create sound DEI plans that supports this work. One of the things that should be abundantly clear, folks, this is not an effort of one. This is not one team. This is not one party. Whether it's cultural intelligence and partnering with our HR, learning and development, or training teams, crisis communication in direct partnership with our communications or agency marketing teams, and then policy knowledge, working with government and public affairs and our legal teams, have to all come together to build the leadership skills that empowers us to move towards success now. The way in which you should think about talking about this, quite simply, anchor it in shared values. Be fact-based, show business alignment, and acknowledge the complexity. Folks, we are in such a troubled world, troubled space, and troubled environment right now, navigating the deep complexities associated with polarization. But all hope is not lost. The work and research has been done. We will not fight rhetoric and misinformation with the same thing. We will continue our commitment to show data, commitment to our business or institution, and ensure that we uphold one mantra to be true very clearly. Systemic solutions are required to promote structural change. You do that, and that's how you navigate polarization and ensure DEI resilience continues to happen. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for our lecture today. There's obviously so much more that we cover and talk about in this space. If you are not following me on LinkedIn already, I highly encourage you to do so. It's just Jarvis Sam. You can't miss it. I have 42-inch rainbow hair. It's in my profile picture. But definitely follow me there. I make updates 2 to 4 times a week on what's happening in the current landscape of this space and what to think about and how to navigate it. Allison's going to share a little bit more about our programmatic side of this as well, for how you can learn more about these experiences too. And then we'll jump into some Q&A because I see some great questions I want to cover with you all today. Allison?
Thank you so much, Jarvis. As I say every time we do one of these webinars, I learned so much from you. And also I feel like I feel motivated and inspired because, as you said, this is such a tough time. And in these tough times, it can be natural response to kind of come into ourselves and to kind of roll up into a ball. And instead, because of your framing of the so what, now what, I feel instead inspired and ready to go to make an impact in my sphere of influence. And I hope everyone here does as well. And so I would love to share with everyone your pathway for how you can continue to learn from Jarvis if you are as inspired as I always am every time I get the chance to learn from him. So I just put a link in the chat to the program as well. And I'm going to give you just a really brief overview into our Applied Inclusive Leadership Strategies certificate, which is a certificate that Jarvis completely designed and runs and created the content for. And so I'm really excited to get to share more information about that with you. Just one moment. It is giving me, the share screen is giving me trouble. So give me just one moment to continue to find my slides. But as I'm doing it, I'm still happy to give you a brief overview. I think that this program is really unique and amazing for a couple of reasons. The first is what I think you saw today in Jarvis's presentation is that everything that he does is incredibly research-based. So everything you're going to learn in this program is going to come from reputable sources, which is something I see a lot of hunger for, in the Q&A, a lot of questions about where can I find more research? Where can I find more data? And this program is going to give you a huge bibliography of both required readings and also optional readings if you are someone who really craves that research and that data. The second thing that I think is really unique, and we're going to go into much more detail about this in just a moment, is that something Jarvis chose to frame his curriculum around competencies rather than vocabulary identity definitions. And I think that that is so powerful because every single week, you're going to take away a tangible skill that you can put into practice right away. Jarvis already spent quite a bit of time talking about why inclusive leadership matters so much, but because I saw that there were a lot of questions in the Q&A for the data, I will spend just a little bit of time on the slide. We are going to also send these slides out to you afterwards. So those of you who asked for sources to cite, you can see this slide has source links at the bottom to the original studies. And so I think something that's very interesting is despite the polarization, the numbers have been really consistent to that show that DEI is one of the most crucial leadership competencies that leaders in any industry at any stage in their career can bring in across a number of different measurements. First of all, if you are someone who is either personally or organizationally motivated by profit, and most of us are, you can feel assured that this is the way to go because more diverse companies are 33% more profitable, according to Forbes. If you're in an experience where your organization or department is experiencing a great amount of change, which most of us are, companies with the highest DEI scores have been shown to have an 80% higher ability to adapt to change, according to Harvard Business Review. And if you're in a position where hiring and retaining great talent is one of your top priorities, the Boston Consulting Group has found that the professionals who work for inclusive organizations report being 3 times happier, meaning that they are more likely to stay. But, and there is a huge but, McKinsey finds that 63 to 80% of employees say that change is happening too slowly. And CIO finds that only 5% of organizations hold executives accountable for racial and ethnic diversity in promotions, and only 7% for gender diversity. So, what Jarvis was saying earlier about how many organizations have missed the mark in terms of actually integrating their DEI goals with their business strategy, we are seeing that on the data level. But we do believe we can change all of this. And so we designed this program with 3 target audiences in mind. The first is HR and DEI professionals. You are the people, you're in the trenches, you are creating more inclusive and diverse teams and organizations every day, all day. Secondly is for, that should say the team leaders and managers. So you don't have to be a DEI professional or an HR professional. You are the people who are trying to make change within your sphere of influence. You're hiring more inclusively, you're managing more inclusively, and you're looking for some help in terms of implementing and finding best practices into your day-to-day leadership. And then thirdly, this is for you. If you have shown up today, you've taken time out of your busy schedule to learn more about this topic, then you are a champion that we need ready to go. This program is a 6-week program. It is designed to take about 2.5 hours of work per week on your own time. So it's primarily an asynchronous program that you can access on demand, making it easier to fit into your busy schedule. And you also have 3 live sessions on weeks 1, 3, and 6 with Jarvis. And Jarvis does an incredible job, of course, with these sessions. He'll start off with bringing in a short lecture that either expounds on something that was already in one of your sessions or might be a hot topic that is going on in the current environment now. Then you'll have time to actually apply what you've learned in small group breakout sessions. And then you'll come back together and ask him anything about what's going on in your organization or get advice on anything that you need help with. The next program will run from September 25th through October 30th, with the live sessions being on September 25th, October 9th, and October 30th. And this is the full schedule, but we're going to go through together week by week what you can expect. Week 1 is on understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is our level setting week. So if you're coming in with no experience working in DEI professionally, that is okay. We still want you, and we are still going to be able to help you level set. And for those of you who have been working for quite a while, I think you will still find some new and exciting things in week 1 as well. And this one, we analyze the benefits and challenges to achieving DEI in the workplace. In week 2, you're going to learn cultural competency and inclusive communication. This week also has a focus on global teams. So if you work with anyone from a different country or who currently lives in a different country, you work with teams in different countries, this is going to be a really helpful week for you to learn what communication assumptions you may be bringing in and how to flex your style for more effectiveness. Week 3 is around implicit bias. And I love this week because it looks at how do you recognize implicit bias in both yourself and others? How do you respond to it in the moment? And then how do you create the conditions to prevent it from happening in the future? So it's a very holistic approach to implicit bias. Week 4 is on managing diversity and conflict. And this one looks at how do you both resolve conflict when it's unhealthy, but also interestingly, and I think this is different than a lot of other programs out there, this one also looks at how do you actually facilitate healthy conflict when it's leading to innovation and new solutions. Because actually something that we find is that more diverse teams are more innovative, but only if all of their views can be heard. And if we're so afraid of conflict that we're starting to, tamp it down when it's actually really productive and really healthy conflict, then you don't get those results of innovation and creativity. So this helps you on both sides of knowing how to resolve conflict when it's unhealthy and how to facilitate it when it's leading to new solutions. Week 5 is my favorite week. It is on how to promote structural equity, and I think this is missing from a lot of other curricula. Because if we were to completely solve bias in ourselves and interpersonally, we would still be missing the structures that often go invisible. So what policies and practices are within your team or your organization that may or may not actually uplift everyone equitably? So this helps you to address the systemic and structural inequities in the workplace. And there's a really strong emphasis on data and metrics, which I saw some of the questions in the Q&A are about that as well. And then week 6 brings it all together. This is the week on how to lead for diversity and inclusion. How do you foster a culture of continuous learning by leading and measuring progress towards DEI initiatives, including ERGs? And this one, you really identify your sphere of influence, which will be different for every participant. And you write an individual action plan for what you want to do differently as a result of this program and how you're going to measure the effectiveness of your initiatives, and you will get individual feedback on your plan. By the end of this program, we commit that you will have developed effective, inclusive leadership initiatives by setting clear goals, creating an action plan, and tracking measurable success. You'll be able to improve communication and collaboration across diverse teams by fostering an environment built on trust and respect. You will gain leadership skills to navigate the complexities of diversity-related challenges and effectively manage and resolve conflict. And you'll identify and dismantle structural inequalities within your organization that hinder progress. And you'll promote a culture of continuous learning so that the learning doesn't just stop with you, it comes throughout the whole organization, where curiosity thrives and new perspectives are embraced. So I hope you're excited about this and you want to join us. We'd love to have you. The enrollment deadline will be September 16th, but we do fill the class on a first come, first served basis. So if you know you want to be a part of this, I would really recommend that you don't delay and that you go ahead and enroll now. We're also running a discount for being here today. And so if you put in the promo code INFO10 for coming to this info session, you'll get a 10% discount. And your next step is just to complete the short enrollment form at this link or at the link that I put in the chat. So thank you so much for being here today. And with that, we are going to move over to the Q&A, which can be about anything you heard today, the program, or about Jarvis's presentation. And I know there were quite a few questions at the beginning, Jarvis, around data and metrics. And so I'm going to kind of combine a few of them to ask you the question of basically like, where do you find your data and metrics and the reputable sources that back up that DEI is really important and continues to be?
Yeah, a few things. One, a lot of it I do and publish myself as an academic. So, I don't I'm obviously very biased through that tune, but we highlight that in a lot of our work and research. But like most things, the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not an exact science. It's a social science, like most others. And two things that I think are important to note. Much with any drivers of business outcomes, it's why, for example, I teach at business school levels as opposed to teaching in undergraduate education or even in social science and humanities programs, because the data that we can leverage to understand business outcomes is actually a lot clearer, for example, than data that we might look at through like a more social scientific lens. To that tune, I know that there was a question in the chat, a question that came up in our Q&A about the McKinsey study, for example. I agree with you. McKinsey did research that was initially published in 2015, 10 years ago, in their Why Diversity Matters study. They doubled down on a lot of that, which have corroborated data in 2018, but a lot of the perspectives on their study, some of the design of the research study has been subject to critique, as in my opinion, most research should be. It doesn't discount the fact that a lot of the outcomes with which they highlighted and some of the impact for organizations that followed their methodology actually has bred really great results. That said, the McKinsey study alone, in my opinion, is actually not the best case in looking at and evaluating what success can be for drivers of business outcomes. As with most social scientific research, we need to amalgamate studies coming from different spaces, from sociology, from psychology, from organizational psychology, to understand what these outcomes look like and can be. So I'm going to link a couple of resources here actually in the chat that I think are super helpful for you to take a look at. There was a Pew Research study that was done that provides some really great insights. HBR has done a lot of really amazing work around this topic. Boston Consulting, Boston Consulting Group did a research study in 2018 linking DEI to innovation revenue. And so, as I define my own approach to this, Allison, it is a combination of both research that's being done by my professor friends who work in social scientific spaces, paired with the research that I do myself in terms of business continuity, etc. But why I think this is a really good question provided both in the chat and in the anonymous Q&A is that it is time, folks, for a new business case for DEI. I think for starters, the way in which we did this work in a pre-Trump America, one, needs to be redefined, and that's looking at both first term and second term. The way in which we did this work prior to George Floyd's murder versus post George Floyd's murder, seeing organizations double down and then the pendulum swing in the opposite direction, needs to be considered in how we think about the impact of DEI. Furthermore, with things like the McKinsey study, profitability, as we know, has two sides to that equation. There's revenue and there's cost. What a lot of the McKinsey study did not fully dive into is things like reputational risk and legal risk come with a significant cost, e.g., Target Corp. And so the new business case for diversity really does need to consider that side of the equation as much as it needs to consider impact on things like innovation revenue. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so
Last week
much.
we got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to get through a couple of these other ones very quickly too, Allison. This
Yep.
program is for anybody, whether an individual contributor or a manager. We have had folks take it across healthcare, life sciences, sports and entertainment, government and media, academia, etc. And so, I definitely think anyone will gain a ton of value from this. And one of the things that I have you do in week 6 is your DEI action plan. And I actually was just on a call with two of my former students just yesterday talking about their action plans, how they're going, and what they're building. And these folks work in the forestry space. So a lot of folks have figured out how to get a lot of value out of these. Metrics that I will utilize or recommend utilizing to continue to have impact in this space. Things like ERG engagement, I think goes a long way. A lot of organizations are hyper investing in their ERGs, and given that those populations represent such a great cross section of various different demographic identities, and they oftentimes are the ones that move us forward toward things like structural and systemic change, understanding what engagement looks like within our ERGs, talking about the specific needs for them is really good. Pulse and engagement surveys as well, with very specific questions, for example, around people's feeling or sentiments of belonging and engagement can go a really long way too toward tracking metrics. We're in a time, space, and environment right now, folks, that I would pause on a lot of the traditional like representation goal data, because a lot of that can feel very tantamount to a quota, which has always been illegal actually under U.S. systems. Post Civil Rights Act of 64 and affirmative action policy, but even more now, it's subjected to a lot of scrutiny. So thinking about those types of topics go a long way. The other question that I want to navigate that I saw in the chat, boom. How do you navigate the challenges around DEI alongside longstanding neoliberal challenges where business models are being weaponized? It's tying it to our business goals. Like, here's the challenge. Again, this is why I teach in business schools, everybody. Because when we think about the corporate strategy of an organization, when we think about the long-term strategy of an academic institution, a DEI strategy should not feel separated or in any way an add-on to those approaches. It has to be directly tied to what are the business drivers and outcomes, for example, that we want to be building for our organization. If we find ways to do that and engage as a collective, we do end up achieving some of the same outcomes to which we desired, but even better, it is a clear tie to our business. In my time at Nike, for example, I can identify various different areas where my team directly contributed to the driving of innovation revenue, for example, for products that were developed to support the growth of the women's business of the organization, particularly in work in direct partnership with the WNBA or work for the tennis line in support and connection with Serena Williams and the work with the Serena Williams design crew. Partnering to understand DEI's direct link to business goals, strategies, and outcomes is how we ultimately promote success in this space. I know there were a lot of questions we weren't able to get to, but as I mentioned before, in fact, I know Gabby asked about materials and resources. Follow me on LinkedIn. Send me an email. I'm happy to share some more details and insights with you. For others that have additional questions about data related topics, let's talk about it. A lot of my work and research over the course of the next 6 months as we enter the 10-year of McKinsey's research study will be affirming and proving, one, that DEI still matters, but how do we do it in the right way amidst polarization? So, Allison?
Thank you so much, Jarvis. And thank you all so much for joining us today and for asking your incredible questions. As Jarvis mentioned, we weren't able to get to all of them, but I also want to give a huge kudos to you, Jarvis, at how many you did get through. You got through a lot. So really, thank you so much for getting through so many questions. And thank you all for asking such great questions and for volunteering to be the champions that we so desperately need to continue to create a world where the world finally works for everyone. That is what we at SPS are here for, and we're here to support you every step of the way. So I hope you choose to join us for our Applied Inclusive Leadership Strategy Certificate. We would love to continue to learn alongside you. And if you do need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be sending the recording in the next 2 business days, and so you'll have a path to reaching out for us. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and take care. See you all later. Bye.